Thank you. It's always an honor to come to Tokyo, to come to Japan. Thank you to Kana and to Code Blue for such a professional and amazing event. So because our task is so difficult as cyber defenders, I'm trying to draw on some inspiration from my and perhaps your favorite movie, Spirited Away. So who am I? I did 20 years in the US government. I worked for FireEye and now for Komodo, but I look at the intelligence picture, so the higher level of who and why of hacking. So I'm primarily looking at the impact and specifically the geopolitics. And what I'm going to show you in this presentation is actually that I think a lot more of what you're seeing when you look at your log files is in fact nation-state hacking, right? And I think I've got the data to prove it. So on the power side of the equation, I think there's maybe three kinds of cyber attack. There's data theft, data denial, and data manipulation. But I think they come in that order in terms of frequency and sophistication. I think a lot of what I'm going to show you is cyber espionage, but therein lies a lot of power for decision makers. So just one analyst, one company, one day, this is what I see, right, in terms of malware detection. Every country, 27 malware types, thousands of malware families, and it's very international space. So there is only one internet, there's only one cyberspace, but hackers are constantly occupying terrain in other countries, giving them potentially dozens of opportunities to collect information that their national security establishment would want to have, right? But from a cyber defense perspective, this is a challenge. I sat at the Pentagon for years trying to figure out this attribution question, much closer to the year 2000. Who's hacking us, right? And long lists of IP addresses, where to start in terms of law enforcement and counterintelligence. Well, as an analyst, one of the ways I do it is try to look at data from interesting perspectives that give insight into how to understand the data. And you can see here very quickly, you can have a picture of vulnerability across the planet, right? Africa, because it's poorer, and there's a lot of conflict zones, they probably don't have a professional cyber defense staff, so they're very vulnerable to worms and viruses, for example. But this gives attackers nice space to operate in, right? If I'm an American hacker that wants to target Japan or vice versa, there's a chance I might bounce through Africa, right? And give me some plausible deniability, some anonymity, because the chances you chase me back are relatively low, right? But so when you look at the planet, each nation is uniquely vulnerable to cybersecurity issues. So here is a scale of just 4 nations, but it's showing you the ratio of malware types within them. And it's interesting to see that if you compare Switzerland to Somalia, for example, vastly different malware types and families inhabit them. In Switzerland, you'll find very highly engineered, high return on investment malware, right? And South Africa, you can see here, very vulnerable to worms and viruses, right? So Switzerland's very tight, right? They have a lot of money, they have a lot of experience with security, and so this is the kind of analysis that I'm doing to understand the space. But the cyber defense advice that you would give to different countries really is unique. Here are some Asian countries on the same type of scale. And I'll just point out two things. Viruses in the Philippines, Russia, Vietnam. You can see that these countries are more vulnerable to older code, right? Older malware that take advantage of either unlicensed, unpatched, pirated software, right? This is not good for them or for the world, but you can see the state of cybersecurity within them. In Japan and South Korea, you can see some similarity in terms of ratios, but also the back doors that I was talking about. And this is indicative of more wealth in these countries and more targeted operations to go after that wealth. In this presentation, I will show you a number of timelines because I find this is one of the most helpful ways to view your data. So if one of your computers is pinging or sending a communication at 2 in the morning, that's a sign of trouble, right, on your network, because nobody should be sitting there. So in the same way, timelines show you when things happen. And it's very important, especially in national security, to see the spikes in malware and their potential causes. So Trojans, I'll just show you 4 malware types. These are our most stable set of malware. But you can see with Ukraine and Egypt, someone on July 29th and August 2nd was very determined to get information out of one of those countries. But Trojans, we have thousands. They're our most complicated data set, but our biggest as well, right? Maybe 80% of our detections or something, non-application, are Trojans. The trouble with a Trojan is it's a Swiss Army knife, right? You can do anything with a Trojan, from just read email to encrypt the hard drive for ransomware. Look at how volatile worms are, right? And in general, you'll see a poorer socioeconomic profile of these countries. But worms, Stuxnet, for example, is often referred to as a worm because it's one of its most powerful characteristics, that worms are autonomous, right? They can travel the internet on their own and take advantage of vulnerabilities at scale, right? So if you're going to target Texas or France, you might need a powerful worm, right, to go after a large, potentially a large target. But you can see here Turkey, India, Brazil, Indonesia. These are places that are poorer, and also you can see, in the case of Russia, Turkey, and Indonesia, these were associated with elections, which I'll show you soon. Ukraine has a real problem with viruses. You can see these are our largest spikes over the course of a year, and these are going to be associated probably with the ongoing conflict with Russia. But it's not only a somewhat poorer country, Ukraine, but is at war, right? Viruses are indicative of a poor state of health on the network. But you can see here that hackers are really taking advantage of Ukraine through that vector. Backdoors, as I've said, I believe are a sign of a more targeted operation, a higher return on investment, higher engineering. But you can see here, so this, unsurprisingly, we see United Kingdom and Italy here, but also Russia. So we'll get into this in a second, but I think a lot of what we see on the networks is in fact geopolitically driven. Now these detections in the UK they match up fairly nicely with the alleged assassination of a Russian spy in the UK. You can see here, if you look at the spike here where Russia is noted, I saw the same backdoor hash, not only in the UK, but also in Russia at the same day and same time, also suggesting a relationship with this malware. So now for some timelines in geopolitics. So this slide shows that in the United States, over a 6-month period, for 3 malware types, worms, Trojans, and viruses, we had the highest single day of detection on March 13th. So sometimes for a spike, I say, well, what was the cause of the spike? Or in other cases, if there's a big event, I'll look for the malware from the other direction. But here, I didn't know what happened on March 13th. So I type into Google, United States, March 13th. And it was the day that Donald Trump announced the new Secretary of State and the name of the new CIA director. And what this does is it gives fresh meat to hackers around the world. And it's not that I'm saying this is the Russians or this is the Chinese. What I'm saying is that a lot of nation states and their state hackers or their contractors, subcontractors, lone wolves, you name it. It's the whole collection of them that all of a sudden have new intelligence requirements, right? And this is not one computer or even 1,000, but these are millions of data points collated. And if you're skeptical on this slide, that's great. Here is a case in which you can see very clearly the relationship, right, between network security and national security. So these are the annual military exercises between the United States and South Korea. And on those very days, you see the Trojan detections in South Korea. They are through the roof. Why? Because not only are the United States and South Korea and North Korea probably interested in what's happening there, but also Japan, also China, also Russia, and some other nations too. June 4th in China, our largest single day of detection this year by far, and this speaks to the power, again, of computer network operations. In this case, it may be some law enforcement, some counterintelligence. But you can be sure that 3-letter agencies in other countries will also be very interested in what's happening in China on the anniversary of Tiananmen Square. Revolution in Armenia also brings interest from hackers, right? Probably domestic and abroad. And what does this mean for you if you're in a healthcare, right, industry? Well, whenever there's a new CEO, acquisitions, stock price, mergers, anything that relates to healthcare on a strategic scale, the same thing is going to happen to you, right, in your industry. In Belarus, they tried to pass legislation against fake news. So we see a spike on that day. Now, it's probably some government action and maybe some foreign governments trying to figure out what's happening. Maybe some students, right? Maybe some potential revolutionaries. But another thing I'm going to show you as we move into the slides is the order of operations for hacking, right? You've probably heard of the cyber kill chain, right? If I'm targeting a person in this audience, I need to know their email address, their IP address, etc. It's the same on a national scale, right? And so what I'm going to show you is that if there's an election coming, there'll be adware. There will be suspicious applications, followed by viruses or worms, followed by Trojans, backdoors. This is the order of operations for hacking, whether it's one person, an enterprise, or a nation. Now, sometimes smaller countries as well, it's even easier to see. But this spike in Nigeria was easy. I typed in Nigeria May 24th, and they were on the cover of CNN with a Amnesty International article decrying the human rights situation in Nigeria. In Nepal, May 28th, the day that Nepal decided not to cooperate with China on developing an international project dam in the country. Here's a financially motivated attack, right? In the little island of St. Kitts Nevis, my daughter actually found this spike, and so then I say, well, what happened there? And it was pretty easy to see. On the same day, on March 13th, the island was placed on an international financial blacklist, right? So that was on the 13th. But on the 12th, already we can see hackers busy trying to take advantage of the situation as in insider trading, right? Somebody knew about this and beforehand and was hacking the country, something related to finances. So that was sometimes looking at spikes and then trying to explain them. But in the next two cases, so the summits in Singapore between Trump and Kim, so that's the only thing in the news for the day. So I pull up Singapore detection, and you can see the interest on the part of hackers, right? Again, most of this will be espionage, but some of it might be more targeted and manipulative operations. You know, it's hard to know, but you can see not only the proximity physically, but in terms of time. So same thing in Finland with the Trump-Putin summit. And the day it was announced, I saw a nice virus spike in Finland. And in order to further confirm the relationship, I said, where did the spike take place? And it was in the neighborhood of Helsinki where the summit would take place, right? Because sometimes you want to be close to your target, right? For not only for logical, but physical connectivity. I have one slide, it's not in this presentation, but a blow-up of Virginia, Maryland, and Washington, D.C., and you see a nice red ring around the White House in terms of malware detection, right? So the hackers are not behaving randomly, but they have a target that they're trying to get close to. So the Saudi journalist, Khashoggi, right, that disappeared on October 2nd. Obviously, this is a major news story with international implications, ultimately that could be regime-changing, right? On October 2nd, already I see suspicious malware detection in Turkey, which tells me that intelligence agencies, informed ones, are seeking information very quickly about what's going on, right? So on October 2nd and October 4th in Turkey, it comes a bit later in Saudi Arabia, but you can see Saudi Arabia, because of its wealth, should be a fairly stable malware environment. But you can see here on October 14th and October 19th, roughly 2 weeks after the disappearance, somebody is very interested in pulling information out of Saudi Arabia. So let's look at a couple of timelines on Japan, and you can't make this stuff up, right? So this is a year and a half worth of malware detection in Japan, just from my company. But I drop it on a slide, and this is what it looks like, right? One massive worm spike, as I said, then followed by Trojan, right? You have to disseminate malware, propagate malware before you can exploit it. So in this case, July 15th, there is a propagation and a crescendo of exploitation up to August 30th. Well, on August 29th, there was a launch of a missile from North Korea over Japan. And I cannot prove that the two things are related, but they definitely appear suspiciously correlated on a timeline. Here, I don't know. I tried to find a relationship, but I'm not sure. But perhaps you, with expert knowledge on your own country, could figure it out. These are applications, and what I want to say here is our malware analysts, at my previous company and now at my current company, they say, why are you looking at applications? And I said, well, are they behaving suspiciously? Yes, they try to change your browser settings, or they try to install functionality in your startup processes, etc. Well, to me, that looks suspicious. And it may not be a backdoor, it may not be a Trojan, but I see suspicious applications clustering around geopolitical events. So, on July 18th or September 11th of this year, maybe something interesting happened in Japan for which someone needed information about what was happening. So that's a lot about the power of computer network operations, especially to collect information quickly. I also think that we have to be realistic about what's possible when we talk cyber war, cyber attack. For example, in Estonia 2007 or Ukraine 2014, we see so many cyber attacks, but are they strategic victories? We don't know, right? There's a famous story about a reporter asked the Chinese Foreign Minister, Zhou Enlai, what do you think about the French Revolution? Was it a good idea or a bad idea? So Zhou Enlai responds, it's too soon to tell, right? 200 years later. But we need patience. And a lot of times, politics, they're short term, right? And so that's one reason I and we can see this close relationship between malware and politics, is because we need information today. So in this case, March 28th, this massive spike in Croatia occurred the same day that Russia was very angry with Croatia over expelling a Russian spy, right? Was this espionage or was it punishment? We're not sure. But is it effective is a whole other question, right? But we can see the data. Here's Ukraine, and for example, May 24th corresponded to heavy fighting in the east of Ukraine. Does it aid the war victory? Sure. Cyber attacks are very capable of gathering information in the same way that the 13th chapter of The Art of War says that generals and leaders must collect as much information as possible, right, about their adversaries. Will they be decisive in warfare is highly unlikely. Here's some cases from the Middle East. And what I can show you is that especially when nations or international organizations are active in Syria, for example, on the issue of chemical weapons, big malware spikes, right? So here we see U.S. airstrikes, U.S. seeks inquiry, chemical weapons thought to be used. These are instances in which computer network operations are leveraged. Here in Yemen, Saudi bombing, missile hits Saudi industrial target, missile fired at Saudi capital, right? When a missile is fired from Yemen into Saudi Arabia, you will see a bump. So one of the papers I'm currently working on is showing that in 2017, there were 9 ballistic missile launches from North Korea. And what we're trying to prove is that each one of them yielded a bump or a spike in malware detection in South Korea, right? So an event that important, the hackers need to get in quickly to understand what's happening. Palestine, the same. UN, International Criminal Court, US. These are international events for which major powers and intelligence agencies are going to need information quickly. So here's one from Iran, right? And again, Pompeo. But the big one on July 24th, right, coincides with the July 23rd tweet from Donald Trump, unless Iran behaves, it will suffer, consequences the likes of which no other country has suffered before. So I think these two things are absolutely related, right? I'm not saying these are necessarily American hackers, but I can say that hackers are very interested in this tense political situation. Here's some North Korea data, because my company, Komodo, is 20 years old, and it's a Turkish company, so we actually have beautiful coverage over parts of the world that some other cybersecurity companies know very little about because of our history. So we have installations in North Korean IP space. So I drop it at a very low level of focus, our detections in South Korea on a timeline, North Korea, and you see this massive spike. It looks like a shark fin, yeah? And that was the very day that Donald Trump was at the United Nations and threatened to destroy North Korea, right? So again, hackers very interested at that point in time about what is happening in North Korea. And the more I dig into the data, the more you can see the reasons for the spikes. And this is why I really do want to suggest that more of what you're seeing in your log files is nation-state activity than you think, right? And less of it is random than you think. So just the tallest spike here, you'd probably be interested. Trump in Japan, Trump in South Korea, Trump in Beijing. So I could do a whole presentation. I've been looking at this data for 2 or 3 years. Trump, Tillerson, Netanyahu, when they travel, a cloud of malware follows them, right? And this is only logical, right? These are major geopolitical events for which 12, 2 dozen, maybe more intelligence agencies, maybe even individual researchers, but certainly contractors are also interested. Again, North Korea, this big spike was anti-censorship programs as well as Windows activation software that we detected, and it coincided when the South Korean and the North Korean leaders were holding hands on the border. It's totally logical, right? It's not random. Here's one last one, a nice spike on July 12th in North Korean IP space when things got really bad between the US and North Korea. We were very frustrated with North Korea. Okay, so the final element, persistence. Now, if you haven't seen Spirited Away, the film, please do yourself a favor and watch it, or if you haven't seen it for a long time. Because as a cyber defense team, and all of us are family to some degree, we see each other at conferences around the world, and we're trying to protect computers. And as Miko put it yesterday, we're trying to protect civilization. There is a lot of malware out there, and it is going to require persistence on our part because the hackers are all day, every day. So I want to show you here the current research that I'm looking at for elections, because this is a hot topic. And again, I find correlations all over the place, right? So when Donald Trump was inaugurated on January 20th, 2017, all this data, all this slide is all of my company's malware detections summed by day for 6 months or something, not sure, 3 months here. Point is the highest cluster, it's easy to see, right? But on such an important day, transfer of power, I know that your emperor, for example, next year there'll be a change, right? Then there'll be the Olympics in Japan. So beware that all of these major events, there are going to be hackers and malware clustering around them. Why? Because it's going to fall under other nations and their contractors' collection requirements. So even in peaceful countries like Norway, which Norway is actually a very strategic player in NATO, right? There's a lot of games taking place currently between Russia and Norway, right? If you think about it, between global warming, submarines, Norway is where a lot of the equipment for NATO is stored for the event of war. You can see that somebody was very interested in their election in Norway. In Iraq as well, not only for the vote, but for the recount, right? Intelligence agencies, very interested. Now, are they trying to manipulate the vote? It's hard to say. But with a Trojan, you can do anything, right? You can steal information, you can block information, or you can manipulate data, right? You can change numbers, right? There might be paper ballots that could correct the record, but after the election's over, there might be no chance for a do-over. Referendum in Burundi. A gubernatorial election, that means governor, right? The leader of Virginia. This was a big race in America. Trump campaigned for his candidate. You can see, this is the week before the election, the number of Trojan detections this is my state currently. In Ohio, we just had a special election, and the various colors here are Trojan detections by state, just dropped on a timeline. You can see Trojans the week prior to the election. Someone very interested in what's taking place. This is incredible. So then I said, well, let me look across the planet and see if I can do something systematic. And so I looked at 45 elections over 6 months at the national level, and about a third of them had a very tight correlation with the highest malware spike. So everything that's left on the chart here is about 30% of the 45. But all of these countries had their highest malware spike within a couple of days of the election or referendum. So now I'm digging in to try and understand this better, and what I'm finding is somewhat alarming. But here, Mali, Russia, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Colombia, you can see this same hacker kill chain, right? Applications, they would be used to gather information, right? And I can't think of another way to do it, because the cyber kill chain for an individual is I have to know your email address, your IP address, your social media account. Well, if I want to target Texas or Moscow, I've got to be able to do that at scale. And so one way to do that would be adware, right? Or some suspicious application that I get, not all of you to install, but maybe half of you, maybe even 10% of you, but then I can extrapolate, right, from that to, as a sample of the data set to the larger group. But applications then followed, I mean, look at Russia. Applications right before the election, right? So that dotted red line is the election. The blue line is the number of suspicious applications that we detected right before the election, followed by worms and Trojans, right? So Turkey as well, the applications came right before the announcement of the election, then followed by worms, and finally Trojans the day or two before the election. So you see the pattern, right? And so in the United States, currently we have an important election. You may be aware, and Trump is very nervous, and the country is on edge. But you can see here we have 50 states, and these are 13 what we call swing states. They could go Democrat or Republican. The other states don't really matter, right? Every election is essentially decided by Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida, etc. So I took the 13 swing states and the 37 non-swing states, and you can see 6 months ago, the math was normal, right? The 37 had, roughly 2 or 3 times the 13. But as we move closer to the election, now the swing states are higher than the non-swing states. So 37 is higher than 13, right? Because the election is just around the corner. And look at this. Just as we saw in other countries, here comes the adware. Here comes the reconnaissance. You need information quickly, right? So you're sending out the suspicious applications and the adware, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4. These are all swing states. These are states that the election will turn on one way or the other. So again, here's 4 more. But you can see, as we approach the election, come the malware. So here is just one effort to see which states are more at risk currently. And you can see, I'll just point out that Nevada, that's in V, you can see more worms are being pumped in there than any other state, right? More viruses into MT or Montana. So this may mean that those states are of particular focus for hackers who are trying to insert malware into that network space, right? So pay attention when you look at your own logs or your own city or country. When you see worm activity especially, that is of high interest, right? Because either by accident or on purpose, malware is coming in to your space. So I'm getting right near the end of the talk, and so all I'm going to say is that the internet, I hope, is more good than bad, right? Is between online education, information sharing, etc., is information technology, hopefully, is great for the planet. Currently, though, I think authoritarian regimes and dictatorships are using the internet as a surveillance tool and as a means of intimidation, right? I see you, right? The United States evidently just sent Russian hackers, according to the news, an email or a text message saying, "We see you, please don't influence our upcoming election," right? Well, at the end of Spirited Away, Chihiro gets the magic hair tie, right? That she gets to take back with her into the human world. And so, to some degree, information technology in a modern sense is magic, right? It really is. If you think about an attack that can manipulate infrastructure and yet on your screen tell you that the infrastructure is working fine, well, this is magic, because you as the owner of the car or the house or the company thinks everything is okay, but in fact, the hackers are manipulating your foundation, right, or your critical infrastructure. So it's hard to know at this point in time, is it mostly good or mostly bad? But we do know that it's powerful, and in many ways, it's magic. So I will leave you there. Many thanks for listening to the presentation. And if you're interested in this kind of research, by all means, send me an email or a text. I've got about 4 million machines reporting every day. And I pull information from around the world looking for this kind of activity. And so, as you can see with the swing states, I'm trying to do some prediction as well, right? So it's not just historical analysis, but we can see where the attacks and the hackers are going. So the power, the persistence of Chihiro, right? Think about it as some inspiration, okay? And I'm happy to take your questions now or this evening over a drink or by email next week. Thank you.